Over the past number of years, Final Fantasy has slowly become one of my favorite game franchises, so I could not wait for Final Fantasy 16. Does any other game franchise have that many numbered entries? Anyways, with each preview and trailer of the game making it look better and better, and with the first M rating a mainline Final Fantasy has ever gotten, this seemed like a new era for Final Fantasy, and I'll just say right off the bat, Final Fantasy 16 is one of the best games in the franchise, maybe even top 3. But let's talk about it. Hi guys, DPX here reviewing today Final Fantasy 16. But before we get started, you know what to do. If you like this video, subscribe, hit the bell, leave a comment, or I will burn you. Needless to say, there is a lot of good in Final Fantasy 16. Of course, we need to talk about the combat. The combat is very divisive, but after playing, it feels simple yet rewarding and nice. There are multiple things you can do, multiple abilities that are called icons. Of course, you have the Phoenix, and that's about all I'm willing to mention and not spoil. Each of them feel really great and really fun to use. Adding on to that though, there are multiple boss fights as there are in like any game ever. But in Final Fantasy 16, they are insane. There was one that annoyed me, but other than that, every boss fight is an absolute banger. Each of them feel like a major fight with a lot of stakes, and more so with the addition of cinematic strikes and cinematic dodges. Basically, a cinematic strike or dodge is basically a cutscene that plays and a command comes up, and you need to press the button it's telling you as a part of the boss fight. It's admittedly nothing new, but it helps me immerse myself in this experience. Additionally, while I wouldn't really call Final Fantasy 16 an open world game, running around the many environments looks great. And that's another thing, the visuals. Final Fantasy 16 might be one of the best looking games of the year, maybe of the generation. This truly seems like a next gen game, a game that could only work on new generation consoles, or at the very least, the game probably could work on a PS4, but would be a lot worse. There are certain cutscenes that'll play, and some are in engine and some are fully CG cutscenes, but really, you can't tell the difference sometimes. The CG cutscenes look really fucking good, of course, but honestly, the in-game dialogue in-engine cutscenes look as good as the actual cutscenes do. I also gotta talk about the story and the many positives. Obviously, there's the story itself. It touches on many mature themes, specifically slavery, which certainly isn't a subject I ever thought would be touched on in a Final Fantasy game, but 16 does it very well. I also just want to talk about Clive, our new main protagonist, as I don't think he is as good as like Cloud or Titus or Squall or some of them, but he's definitely up there. Clive goes through a wild journey and arc, and everything with him feels earned. And that is further proven by the performance of Ben Starr as Clive. And honestly, when the Game Awards comes by, just give best performance to him and call it a day. But Clive isn't the only character, because as is usual with Final Fantasy, there is an ensemble cast of characters. Obviously, you got Clive, who I just mentioned, and you have his trusty wolf buddy, Torgal, but there are 3 other allies of Clive's that I want to mention. One is his brother, Joshua. Without getting into spoilers, if you've played the demo, you see what happens to Joshua, but throughout the rest of the game, to put it in a way that's not spoilery, we find out more about him, and I thought it was all very compelling. One of the other characters I want to mention is Jill, Clive's love interest. To be fair, she is kinda just the love interest, but later on in the game she becomes a bit more important to the plot in a very compelling way. And last but certainly not least, Cid. Final Fantasy 16 keeps the tradition of having a new character named Cid, but this has to be the best Cid we've ever had, with what they do with him. And the performances all really sell all the characters. The emotion is done perfectly as well, and starting to get me choked up a little bit at times. I also gotta mention the music. Final Fantasy has always had great music. Even some of the worst games in the franchise have bangers. So it should come as no surprise that Final Fantasy 16 has a banging soundtrack, and without question, one of the best we'll get this year. Everything sounds like they fit this new tone and aesthetic while also sounding like Final Fantasy. And speaking of the tone, Final Fantasy XVI marks the first mainline game of the franchise to be rated M, and for the story and world of this game, the M rating fits. Never feels like it's trying too hard to be edgy, something I feel like it ran the risk of doing, but it has blood, gore, nudity, and many F-bombs, in addition to the subject of slavery I mentioned, which I think might have helped get it an M rating. But it all feels natural and, you know, kind of normal. I mean, it's not normal necessarily for Final Fantasy, but it feels like, you know, this is kind of how it is. I hope you understand what I just said. I also love the world of Final Fantasy XVI. I mentioned I love the world to run around in, but the world within the game, like the actual world, feels like a lived-in, breathed-in world. And lastly, there is the post-game content. I don't usually touch on post-game content, but in Final Fantasy XVI, once you beat it, and this was already revealed so it's not a spoiler, you will unlock a new difficulty called Final Fantasy Mode, which is a hard mode that has many features exclusive to it, which is really cool. And there's even an arcade mode where you get to fight all the bosses. It goes without saying that Final Fantasy XVI is a top-tier Final Fantasy game and a top-tier game of this year.
There it is. The bell tower.
Right. Let's go.
As for the mixed, the first thing is that it's not for everybody. This isn't something I'm holding against the game, but rather something worth noting, as yes, it seems like a popular thing for people who haven't played Final Fantasy XVI to hate on it, but I've heard from a few people who did play it but don't like it, and don't like the new gameplay and combat, which is fine. Little side note, little side tangent, I don't have this written down or anything. You can tell when someone genuinely played the game and didn't like the changes made, and when someone did not play the game but they're just hating on it just to hate on it. You can tell. I just wanted to say that. Alright, moving on. Personally, I love the new gameplay and combat and the changes, but I could understand why people wouldn't love it. The other mixed thing is there are a lot of cutscenes. And I mean, there are about 20 hours total of cutscenes in this game. I have this under mixed because as long as the cutscenes are telling a good story, then it's not much of an issue, but some cutscenes go on for a while, so that might annoy some people. But other than that, those are the only mixed things I got, and no, struggling to hit 60 FPS is not an issue. I'm starting to think 60 FPS is something people pretend to care about because it makes them sound smart, when in reality, not hitting 60 FPS doesn't fucking ruin the game. Wow, another side tangent, I need to stop. Now, as for the bad, there are some small issues. There was one cutscene, and I do mean one cutscene, but there was one cutscene where two characters were fighting a bunch of enemies, and the characters were stabbing the enemies and swinging their swords and all that, but the sound effects weren't there. I would show it, and I would play it for you, but it's kind of a spoilery scene. Not really, but like, it reveals some spoilers, and also I did not record the scene. I don't know, it just happened once and never again, and never before as well. But for how polished this game is, that really stood out to me. And lastly, even though I really loved the story, there were some small issues I had with it. Specifically, without getting into spoilers, there is a bit of a villain problem, kind of. Not that any of the villains are bad, and not that it doesn't balance them well, you know, because there are quite a few of them, but I'd say it balances them all well. But there is one villain in particular that, with the way their story ended, had me scratching my head, I'll just say. That and the third act of the story, I still love it, but it is a huge departure and shift from the first two acts. Acts as in the first 2/3 of the game. But none of these really ruin the game for me. Simply put, what Final Fantasy XVI is to the Final Fantasy franchise is what God of War 2018 was to the God of War franchise. In that, Final Fantasy XVI takes the FF franchise and changes it for the better. I know not everybody agrees with that, and I wouldn't mind a new turn-based game here and there, but I think this is the way to go for Final Fantasy. Not to mention the tone and gameplay and M rating and the characters and of course the story and of course times 2 the insane boss fights makes it not matter all too much that some of the cutscenes go on for a little long and the last third of the game goes in, I'll just say, an interesting direction. All the positives makes me forget the smaller negatives, and for that reason, yup, Final Fantasy XVI gets a 10 out of 10. Can I just say, what a year for gaming so far, and we're only in the first half. This is the 4th game I've given a 10 out of 10, and on the one hand, I don't know how I feel about that, because I feel like I'm devaluing the 10 out of 10 score, but on the other hand, the game deserves it. It deserves it. And I think Final Fantasy XVI deserves it. Maybe I might need to sit on this one a little bit and see how I feel about it, like at the end of the year possibly. But as of right now, I think it's a 10 out of 10. But those are my thoughts. What do you guys think about Final Fantasy XVI? Have you guys played it? Have you guys not played it? Do you like it? Do you not like it? And if you haven't played it, do you guys want it, not want to play it? Anything about the game, let me know down below. Anyways, be sure to comment, subscribe, or I will burn you. Bye!